foundation that you've laid in their life, and we're just thankful for that, God. We love you. We say this in your name. Amen. You guys can go have a seat. One more time, give it up for our youth worship band. All right. So guys, this morning, this is one of those Sundays that for me is I always look forward to it. This and like grad Sundays are some of my favorite Sundays I get to be a part of, and just because there's just something really cool and special about pausing to see what God is doing, not just in our lives, but also in the lives of our next generation. And so we got to hear from our kiddos and kind of what God's doing in our nursery and our, with people just helping cuddling babies and downstairs in the classroom. But we also, I want to give a moment to also hear, what's God doing in our youth, with the middle schoolers and high schoolers at our youth group. And so I want to invite up Evie Johnson's going to be sharing this morning a little bit about her faith journey, but also kind of, the role. Yeah, you can go ahead and grab that and come on up. And then going to be sharing a little bit about, how is like the role of other people investing in her life has gone. She came prepared. There you go. Way to go, Evie. So Evie, I know when we talk, I ask kind of just sharing a little bit about what have been some of the most memorable or impactful moments or memories that you have being part of youth group the past couple of years?
Probably.
There you go.
It's on now?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
You're good.
Probably the most impactful part is having a community that I know I can lean on for my faith journey and stuff like that. And it makes me feel seen and heard more than I do in some other places.
Yeah, and so Evie's been, she's been part of our youth group past couple of years, a couple of years now. It's been really fun having you, Evie, just kind of hanging around and being part of our community. And so when you think back to some of those, like you said, impactful moments and those things that you've seen happen in youth group, what have been how have you seen kind of God grow your relationship with him, or just kind of grow you in general these past couple of years?
I felt more comfortable with my faith and sharing it out, and not being scared or feeling afraid that people will judge me for my faith and what I believe in. And it's just youth group has helped me see that it's good to be open and talk to other people about it.
Yeah. That's awesome, dude. And then just we're going to be talking a little bit more about people that invest in your faith and people that have played a role and just various different ways. How has the encouragement and support of your leaders and friends, youth group, kind of help you grow in your faith? How have you seen that play a role?
I've seen my friends at youth group, they're really comfortable with Genevieve inviting other people from her school that may or may not be Christians to come to youth group just to have a fun time. But then they just keep coming back, and it's really cool to see how just one invite can help grow a whole new relationship with God. And so I felt more comfortable talking to my friends about it, at our dance studio and other places, and inviting them and to do stuff.
So you feel that having watching other friends be part of this, but also having leaders and other people kind of invest in you, you feel hey, I now have the courage where I can go and share what God's doing in my life and talk to people about it. That's really cool. Genevieve, or Evie, thank you so much. I was looking at Genevieve. You mentioned Genevieve. Hey, thank you so much. Give it up for Evie. I realized I was having a hard time count this morning and apparently just saying words in general. So this next 15 minutes is going to be really fun. Well, guys, like I said, I think something hearing Evie's story and those kind of things are good reminders of kind of what God does with those little investments and just kind of what he does in those moments. I'm going to get my little notes open here, but I think it's just kind of really beautiful about when she was telling me kind of what she was going to talk about. I was it wasn't anything grandiose that people were doing. It was just the little things, right? The little things that people were doing to invest in her and really kind of play a role in her life, and those little things had a really massive impact on her faith. And I'm certain if you were to ask some of the other kids in our youth group, they would have similar stories of how little investments have made a big difference. And it's a lot when I think about this idea of we're going to spend some time talking about how do we as a church invest in the next generation. It makes me think of like planting a tree. Years ago, my mom and dad planted this tree in our yard. It's a box elder from Ohio, and it came from my grandpa. And she got a little sapling, and they planted our yard, and they made little, they plant it, they water it, do little things, and the thing is, like, over time, like, you didn't really see, like, much growth. Like, there were times I almost, like, ran over it with a lawnmower. Like, it wasn't that big. But then all of a sudden, if I were, like, now, 30 years later, like, it's so funny, like, these little investments my mom and dad made in growing this tree, now it's a tree that, like, Ellie gets to swing on, right? It's a tree that Ellie gets to go and play on the swing, and, like, I think those little things, I don't know if my mom and dad realized when they were planting this tree the impact it was going to have. They didn't realize that, that one day these little acts of just watering and planting are going to be something that's going to actually be a blessing to their granddaughter. And I think about it when we talk about investing in the next generation, it's a lot like planting something or planting a tree where it takes time and care, but it also takes trust. It takes trust that, that God's going to take those little investments that we do and he's going to grow it into something beautiful. Those little things we do that maybe in the moment we don't feel like are making a difference, they're actually making a big difference. And sometimes those differences we don't see right away. Sometimes those differences take years to blossom. But it's a lot of taking time and care and trusting. And the cool thing is we all get to be part of that process. God invites us to be part of that process with him. He says in Matthew 28, it says, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I've given you. And be assured of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." And so when we say yes to following Jesus, part of what we're saying yes to is also going to be part of this really beautiful role of cultivating and investing in other people. And so since today's Next Gen Sunday, the question I want to ask is, well, how do we do that? Like, how do we positively invest in the lives of our next generation? Like, what does it look like for us to be cultivators as a church? And so I want to we're going to talk a little bit about, like, how do we do that specifically as a kids ministry and a youth ministry, but then I also want to talk a little bit about, how do we as a bigger church do that? Like, if you're like, hey, I don't volunteer on Wednesday nights, or I'm not in the nursery, how do I really play a role? Well, you do, and we'll share a little bit about how. But before we kind of get to any of those, I want to look at something that Paul said in 1 Corinthians that I think is really helpful and impactful for how we think about this, our role as people who cultivate and who invest in the lives of the next generation. Just kind of give a little bit of context. When Paul wrote these words, in this part of the letter that he was writing, he was recognizing he was dealing with some divisions, really pretty significant divisions that were happening within the Corinth church. That there was factions that started forming based on preferences they had for certain leaders like Paul and Apollos and even Peter, and that these kind of allegiances or these loyalties were kind of starting to become, they're messing with community. And so he ends up spending like 4 chapters in the first 4 chapters of 1 Corinthians addressing some of these. And it's in chapter 3 that when he's addressing this, that he shares something that I think is really helpful for, I think, of how we invest in our next generation, how we spend time cultivating and investing in them and encouraging them in their faith. And so this is what Paul has to say in this part of, so it's 1 Corinthians 3, verses 5 to 9. He says, "After all, who is Apollos? Who is Paul? We're only God's servants through whom you believed the good news. Each of us did the work the Lord gave us. I planted the seed in your hearts, and Apollos watered it, but it was God who made it grow. It's not important who does the planting or who does the watering. What's important is that God makes the seed grow. The one who plants and the one who waters work together with the same purpose, and both will be rewarded for their own hard work. For we are both God's workers, and you are God's field, and you are God's building." So what's Paul saying here, right? Knowing that within the context of what he's saying, what's he saying here? And I think when you think about how we invest in the next generation, I think there's 2 things I want to point out that what Paul is saying. I think the first one is that when we think about, how do we invest in somebody else? How do we help them grow? He kind of checks us real quick and says, remember that we are not the source of growth. We are not the person that makes things grow in somebody else's life. That is God's role. And he says that, and some of these Corinthian Christians said that they were attached to these leaders because they were kind of that they were seeing these leaders as their sources of growth, but the truth is, like, only God is the one who causes the growth in our lives. Right? Just like planting a tree, that we do things that help kind of make it as helpful or likely as possible, but we don't make the tree grow. That's God's role. God makes the tree grow. In the same way that we don't make somebody else's life, that we can't force growth to happen. But what God does say is, he says that you may not be the source of the growth, but you are cultivators. Right? You do have a role to play. That you're not just, that your job is not to just do nothing. He says that you actually get to play a role in their life. You get to do the little things to help aid in the process, to be part of that investment process. Just like watering and planting the seeds, or maybe when the tree gets bigger, right, you prune it a little bit. It says you play a role in helping it along. And so that's true, right? If we don't make growth happen, but we help cultivate, we help kind of invest and do the things to help along in the process, well, what does that actually look like? And Paul kind of hints at it, but how do we, as a church, positively invest in the lives of our next generation? And so, like I said, I want to start with looking at how does this look like? How do we do this as a youth group? How do we do this as a kids ministry? But then I also want to say, how do we also do this as a greater church body? So let's start with as a youth group and kids ministry. Well, for us, we say our first goal is we want to establish good soil. If you've planted something, good soil is really important. I learned this hard lesson when planting grass. It took me 2 years to realize, hey, I should probably pay attention to the soil I put down in my yard, right? Because that actually helps a lot in the growth process. And it's the same thing when we talk about our youth. When we talk about our next generation, that having good soil. And for us, good soil means that we want to cultivate an environment where kids feel loved and cared for, all the way from diapers to diplomas. We want them to know that church is a place you belong. You are welcome here. And that's something me and Melissa really feel strongly about, that we and our leaders and our volunteers, so that we want kids to know that church is a place where they're loved and cared for. It doesn't matter what they're coming in with, that they're welcomed in this space. And one of my favorite quotes is, I think it gets attributed to a lot of other people, but I think it started with Teddy Roosevelt, where he says, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And for us as a youth ministry to kids ministry, we really take that to heart, that we want our kids to know that we care about them. They matter to us. And those relationships we build, the trust we build, is the soil, right? That we're establishing the good soil. We're establishing the place where when we can talk about Jesus, there's trust, that they know that we care for them. And that's really important to us. So building a good soil, right? Or in our kind, we say, hey, belonging. Belonging is a really, really important thing. But it's not just that, right? That's not the main goal. That's not all we're shooting for. But that's the starting line. So we say establishing good soil, but also watering and planting seeds. All right? We really care about watering and planting seeds. That our work isn't just to create good soil. It's not just to create a really fun hangout, which I hope we do, right? Hopefully on Wednesday, and on Sunday mornings, that the kids are having fun, the students are having fun. But that's not all we're trying to do, right? That just like every plant needs seed being planted and needs to be watered, we really feel like that's really important. That's why I love these two pictures of Malia and Becca just reading to our kids, because when we think about planting seeds, it's about reading stories, telling about who Jesus is, reminding them of who Jesus is, and then also entering into conversations with them. Well, what does that look like in your everyday life? For maybe the little kids, it's hey, maybe why is it good for you not to hit your little brother or sister, right? Or why is it good to be respectful of your mom and dad? Or I know in the youth group having the conversations with our youth of what does this look like when you go to school? What does this look like on your baseball team? Or how do you wrestle through some difficult conversations of how you navigate real life? And so for us, we want to plant the seeds, we want to point them to Jesus, but then we also want to water it. We want to help them navigate, well, how do we do this? How does this actually play out in everyday life? How do you actually walk through this? And so for us, that's what that looks like, is reading Bible stories, right? Reading Bible stories and sitting around a table and having discussions on Sunday morning, or on Wednesday night, we have something called small groups, where every time we do a sermon, I don't say, all right, that's it. Go home. You guys, that's all you need to know. We actually spend twice as much time in our small groups than we do me getting up front and talking, because we dude, I don't want to just have you take in information. We want to water the seed that's planted. We want to actually help you figure out, what does this look like? How do I live this out? And so for us, like, that developing good soil place where kids feel like they belong, but then also planting and watering seeds is really important. So good soil, planting and watering seeds, and then we say creating a space to grow, right? Letting them, or as we sometimes say, is like we kind of think of the belong, believe, become. That we want them, we want to create space for them to really explore. Okay, Jesus, who are you, and what do you mean to me? How do I live out the rest of my life? And giving them a space to explore that. Some ways we do that. A couple years ago, we got to go on a Portland mission trip, and it was so much fun, but also really powerful. Of doing some really hard work, and one of the first nights we drove through Portland for a lot of people that were homeless and struggling, and having to wrestle through tough questions like, okay, well, what does it look like? How do we wrestle through our faith knowing that there's some really hard things that are existing in the world, right? But then giving, not like force-feeding it, but giving kids a space to explore it and ask questions. Or, having a chance to exercise that by practicing things like making sandwiches for the Union Gospel Mission. We do, every few months we make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and say, okay, well, how does your faith look like being put into practice? And doing things like we do encounter nights where we'll have worship, but we'll just kind of create like these, let kids explore and say, hey, have prayer nights where they, instead of me like preaching, we'll give them prompts and like, hey, I want to give you like 30 minutes just to think about what this means for you. Sitting in silence and just kind of asking God, where are you leading me right now? Because for us, part of exploring and growing is giving them the guardrails to say, we want you to experience God for who he is, and we want to give you the guardrails, but we want you to experience that yourself. And so for a lot of ways, just like planting a tree, like we have to entrust, we plant the seeds, we water them, and then we entrust our students to God and give them the guardrails to say, how do you help them navigate their faith with God and trust that God's going to use the seeds that we've planted and watered to help them grow. So all that, right? Like maybe you're going, that's a lot, man. For me, like I get excited thinking about that. I love thinking about because you hear stories like Evie's, right? And I could tell you all kinds of stories of how we've seen these things bear fruit in our kids' lives and how we've seen really cool things happen. And so, like, this is really cool stuff that we get to see happen in the lives of our youth. And so maybe you're asking, like, Robbie, okay, I know you're saying that we all get to be cultivators, we all get to invest in the lives of our youth, but, like, I'm not there on a Wednesday night. I'm probably not going to be, right? Or I'm not there on, like, Sunday morning. Like, you're here to tell me that I actually play a role in the kids' lives, and I say, absolutely. You, even if you're not there on Wednesday night, even if you're not downstairs or in the nursery, like, you play a massive role in our kids' faith development and where they're at in their life. And so I want to just give a few practical ways that you can be part of this. Here's ways that you can continue to encourage them in their faith and some of the things we talked about, right? How you can reinforce some of that. Some of it is just encouraging them, right? Reminding them like things like today isn't like it's fun, but honestly, part of the reason why we do it is because we want our kids to know that it's not just youth group that cares about you; it's a whole church that cares about you, right? That this is a big deal. You guys remember a couple years ago, there's a kid named Alex who was actually up here on Grad Sunday, and he ended up getting baptized. And one of the coolest conversations I got to have with him was after Grad Sunday, about a month or so. He told me he wanted to give his life to Christ. He got baptized. I remember just asking him, like, Alex, what was the turning point, man? Like, what was it that made you say you wanted to follow Jesus? And he said it was standing up on stage on Grad Sunday. He goes, when I looked out and you guys told me I was family, he goes, that was it for me. And what's cool is each and every one of you got to play a role in that. You created a space where he felt loved, and he got to show up, and because of him, that played a huge role in him saying yes to Jesus. So understand that just encouraging him, creating a space to let them know, hey, we're so excited you're here, and you matter to us. That's huge. Praying for them, right? Even if, like praying for our next generation, because sometimes it's just really hard. Going through school is hard. Dealing with friends' struggles is hard. It can be really difficult. Going through middle school and high school, or going through elementary school, and all the little stressors that come with that, right? So maybe it's just simply praying for them and being mindful of, like, oh God, I just really want to pray for our next generation and encourage them and remind, make yourself known to them, remind them that you're there with them, right? Leaving space for them. right? Being patient with them, recognizing that sometimes I think we can all recognize that for us, our journey wasn't just like all the way up and to the right? That it wasn't always just smooth sailing. Like there were some bumps and bruises along the way. And that's the same with them. They're going to have bumps and bruises on their faith journey. And I think it's really important for us to remember as a church, like how can we be there for them when they experience the bumps and bruises? How can we be there for them when they're wrestling? And remind them that, hey, we're glad you're here. We're excited you're here. And even if you're struggling or asking some really difficult questions, we want to come alongside you and help you with that. We want to be here for you in those questions. And then celebrate with them. Man, when things are struggling, we want to like leave space for them and journey with them. But then when things are hard, or when things are good, celebrate with them. I mentioned earlier Grad Sunday. One of the coolest things we get to do is celebrate with our next generation, like a big milestone, like graduating. But we don't have to wait for Grad Sunday to like celebrate milestones they hit in their life. Like when a kid gets a driver's license, like if you know that, like, hey man, that's so cool. Like knowing that there's people that are cheering for you makes a big difference. So here's what I want to leave you with this morning. I could talk about this all day, but I know I don't want to keep you here super late. But here's a thought for the drive home I want you to be thinking about as you kind of go out and go watch the Chiefs lose, hopefully. Sorry if you're a Chiefs fan, but not that sorry. Who are some of the people that positively invested in your faith journey? I want you to think about who are some people that positively invested in your faith journey. Maybe for you it was at youth group or in a nursery or like a children's ministry room. Maybe there was a leader that really sticks out to your mind, that someone that did some of these things for you. Maybe it was a parent. Maybe it was just a friend. Whoever it was. Who was it that played a role positively in your faith journey? But then I want you to flip that, thinking about who that person was, and say, how can I be that for somebody else? And especially, how can I be that for our next generation? Like, how can you positively invest in the faith journey of our next generation? Whether that's high schoolers or middle schoolers or the kids downstairs, how can I do that? And maybe, honestly, probably just want to continue to do that. Because one of the things I am so thankful of, as someone who gets to spend time with these awesome kids every Wednesday and as a parent of a kid downstairs, man, like, it's so heartwarming to know that, like, my kid is cared for. And our youth group kids are cared for. Like, I'm not concerned about us showing up on a Sunday morning and us playing the songs we play every Wednesday night. Like, it makes me happy that our church gets excited about that. But how can you continue to invest in that? How can you continue to be a part of that? So I want you to think about that. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to sing another song together. But why don't you join me in prayer? God, thank you so much for you, Lord. Thank you for the stories that you are. Thank you for all of the beautiful things that, Lord, you're doing in the lives of our middle schoolers, our high schoolers, our elementary kids, our nursery kids. Lord, thank you. And even, Lord, that we have college kids in our midst, and we're thankful for what you're doing. And, man, just some of the stories of them moving on from youth group and just the amazing memories they have and getting to be part of this place still. And, God, we're thankful for that. And we just pray that, Lord, you continue to work in the lives of our next generation. And help us, Lord, to know how can we come alongside you as being cultivators, being people that invest in our next generation. How can we do that well? How can we how can we invest in people the same way that people invested in us? Lord, maybe we need to be challenged in that. Maybe we need to be encouraged in that, what you're already doing in us. But pray, help us to see where you want us to continue to do that well. So, God, we love you. We say this all in your name. Amen. Hey, so I'm gonna invite our youth worship team to come on up, and we're gonna sing one more song. While we do that, guys, why don't you go ahead and stand with us?